Hello, my darlings. Squirrel Squad all back here. Oh, Sammy. Hey, Hannah's coming tomorrow, so I'm hoping we're going to get brick wall. Woohoo! And then I'll be able to put up the sign that Sue gave us. Welcome to the nut house. And the shelves that Miss Donna gave us. Put this stuff back up. And the sign that Miss Tina crocheted. Woohoo! I'm excited. Y'all pray. Me and Hannah don't get lazy. If we don't have a hard time, we can get it up. Get it up and get it looking good. And we are, I do believe, I bookmarked chapter 3, Across the Moor. And this is the secret garden. She slept a long time, and when she awakened, Mrs. Medlock had bought, excuse me, I got a smudge. I should check all this before I start. Goodness gracious. Do a little beginning dab. That's a little better. Bought a lunch basket at one of the stations, and they had some chicken and cold beef and bread and butter and some hot tea. The rain seemed to be streaming down more heavily than ever, and everybody in the station wore wet and glistening waterproofs. They might call them wellies, as in Wellingtons. The guard lighted the lamps in the carriage, and Mrs. Medlock cheered up very much over her tea and chicken and beef. She ate a great deal and afterward fell asleep herself, and Mary sat and stared at her and watched her fine bonnet slip on one side until she herself fell asleep once more in the corner of the carriage, lulled by the splashing of the rain against the windows. It was quite dark when she awakened again. The train had stopped at a station, and Mrs. Medlock was shaking her. "You have had a sleep," she said. "It's time to open your eyes. We're at Thwaite Station, and we've got a long drive before us." Mary stood up and tried to keep her eyes open while Mrs. Medlock collected her parcels. The little girl did not offer to help her because in India, native servants always picked up or carried things, and it seemed quite proper that other people should wait on one. The station was a small one, and nobody but themselves seemed to be getting out of the train. The station master spoke to Mrs. Medlock in a rough, good-natured way, pronouncing his words in a queer, broad fashion, which Mary found out afterward was Yorkshire. "I see they's got back," he said, "and they's brow the young'uns with thee. Brawn, the young'uns with thee." "Aye, that's her," answered Mrs. Medlock, speaking with a Yorkshire accent herself, and jerking her head over her shoulder toward Mary. "How's thy missus? Welly now? The carriage is waiting outside for thee." Not doing too good on it. Brougham stood on the road before the little outside platform. Mary saw that it was a small carriage and that it was a smart footman who helped her in. His long waterproof coat and the waterproof covering of his hat were shining and dripping with rain, as everything was, the burly station master included. When he shut the door, mounted the box with the coachman, and they drove off, the little girl found herself seated in a comfortably cushioned corner, but she was not inclined to go to sleep again. She sat and looked out the window, curious to see something of the road over which she was being driven to the queer place Mrs. Medlock had spoken of. She was not at all a timid child, and she was not exactly frightened, but she felt there was no knowing what might happen in a house with 100 rooms, nearly all shut up, a house standing on the edge of a moor, "What is a moor?" she said suddenly to Mrs. Medlock. "Look out the window in about 10 minutes and you'll see," the woman answered. "We've got to drive 5 miles across Missile Moor before we get to the manor. You won't see much because it's dark night, but you can see something." Mary asked no more questions, but waited in the darkness of her corner, keeping her eyes on the window. The carriage lamps cast rays of light at a little distance ahead of them, and she caught glimpses of the things they passed. After they left the station, they had driven through a tiny village, and she had seen whitewashed cottages and the lights of a public house, which is a pub. Then they passed a church and a vicarage and a little shop window or so in a cottage with toys and sweets and odd things set out for sale. Then they were on the high road, and she saw hedges of trees. After that, there seemed nothing different for a long time, or at least it seemed a long time to her. At last, the horses began to go more slowly, as if they were climbing uphill, and presently there seemed to be no more hedges and no more trees. She could see nothing, in fact, but a dense darkness on either side. She leaned forward and pressed her face against the window just as the carriage gave a big jolt. "Aye, we're on the moor now, sure enough," said Mrs. Medlock. The carriage lamp shed a yellow light on a rough-looking road which seemed to be cut through bushes and low-growing things, which ended in the great expanse of dark apparently spread out before and around them. A wind was rising and making a singular, wild, low, rushing sound. It's not the sea, is it?" said Mary, looking round at her companion. "No, not it," answered Mrs. Medlock. "Nor it isn't fields nor mountains. It's just miles and miles of wild land that nothing grows on but heather and gorse and broom, and nothing lives on but wild ponies and sheep." "I feel as if it might be the sea if there were water on it," said Mary. "It sounds like the sea just now." "That's the wind blowing through the bushes," Mrs. Medlock said. "It's a wild, dreary enough place to my mind, though there's plenty that likes it, particularly when the heather's in bloom." On and on they drove through the darkness, and though the rain stopped, the wind rushed by and whistled and made strange sounds. The road went up and down, and several times the carriage passed over a little bridge, beneath which water rushed very fast, and a great deal of noise. Mary felt as if the drive would never come to an end, and that the wide, bleak moor was a wide expanse of black ocean through which she was passing on a strip of dry land. "I don't like it," she said to herself. "I don't like it," and she pinched her thin lips more tightly together. The horses were climbing up a hilly piece of road when she first caught sight of a light. Mrs. Medlock saw it as soon as she did and drew a long sigh of relief. "I am glad to see that bit of light twinkling," she exclaimed. "It's the light in the lodge window. We shall get a good cup of tea after a bit, at all events." It was after a bit, as she said, for when the carriage passed through the dark gates, there was still 2 miles of avenue to drive through, and the trees, which nearly met overhead, made it seem as if they were driving through a long, dark vault. They drove out of the vault into a clear space and stopped before an immensely long but low-built house, which seemed to ramble round a stone court. At first, Mary thought there were no lights at all in the windows, but as she got out of the carriage, she saw that one room in a corner upstairs showed a dull glow. The entrance door was a huge one, made of massive, curiously shaped panels of oak studded with big iron nails. Excuse me. and bound with great iron bars. It opened into an enormous hall, which was so dimly lighted that the faces and the portraits on the walls and the figures in the suits of armor made Mary feel that she did not want to look at them. And she stood on the stone floor. As she stood on the stone floor, she looked a very small, odd little black figure, and she felt as small and lost and odd as she looked. A neat, thin old man stood near the manservant who opened the front door for them. "You are to take her to her room," he said in a husky voice. "He doesn't want to see her. He's going to London in the morning." "Very well, Mr. Pitcher," Mrs. Medlock answered. "So long as I know what's expected of me, I can manage." "What's expected of you, Mrs. Medlock," Mr. Pitcher said, "is that you make sure that he's not disturbed and that he doesn't see what he doesn't want to see." And then Mary Lennox was led up a broad staircase and down a long corridor and up a short flight of steps, through another corridor and another, until a door opened in a wall and she found herself in a room with a fire in it and a supper on a table. Mrs. Medlock said unceremoniously, "Well, here you are. This room and the next are where you'll live. You must keep to them. Don't you forget that." It was in this way Mistress Mary arrived at Misselthwaite Manor, and she had perhaps never felt quite so contrary in all her life. And we'll be at chapter 4, and since we've only read almost 12 minutes, we'll go on. Chapter 4 is entitled Martha. When she opened her eyes in the morning, it was because a young housemaid had come into her room to light the fire and was kneeling on the hearth rug, raking out the cinders noisily. Mary lay and watched her for a few moments and then began to look about the room. She'd never seen a room at all like it, and thought it curious and gloomy. The walls were covered with tapestry, a forest scene embroidered on it. There were fantastically dressed people under the trees, and in the distance there was a glimpse of the turrets of a castle. There were hunters and horses and dogs and ladies. Mary felt as if she were in the forest with them. Out of a deep window she could see a great climbing stretch of land which seemed to have no trees on it, and to look rather like an endless dull purplish sea. "What's that?" she said, pointing out of the window. Martha, the young housemaid, who had just risen to her feet, looked and pointed also. "That there?" she said. "Yes, that's the moor," with a good-natured grin. "Does thou like it?" "No," answered Mary, "I hate it." "That's because thou'rt not used to it," Martha said, going back to her hearth. "They thinks it's too big and bare now, but thy will like it." "Do you?" inquired Mary. "Aye, that I do," answered Martha, cheerfully polishing away at the grate. "I just love it. It's none bare. It's covered with growing things as smells sweet. It's fair lovely in spring and summer when the gorse and broom and the heather's in flower. It smells a honey, and there's such a lot of fresh air, and the sky looks so high, and the bees and skylarks make such a nice noise humming and singing. I wouldn't live away from the moor for anything." Mary listened to her with a grave, puzzled expression. The native servants had been used to it. The native servants she had been used to in India were not in the least like this. They were obsequious. Here's a word for you. obsequious. Obsequious and servile, servile. which makes me think of severe, but it's servile or servile, and did not presume to talk to their masters as if they were equals. They made salams and called them, or salams, and called them protector of the poor and names of that sort. Indian servants were commanded to do things, not asked. It was not the custom to say please and thank you, and Mary had always slapped her ayah in the face when she was angry. She wondered a little what this girl would do if one slapped her in the face. She was a round, rosy, good-natured-looking creature, but she had a sturdy way which made Mistress Mary wonder if she might not even slap back, if the person who slapped her was only a little girl. "You are a strange servant," she said from her pillows rather haltingly. Martha sat up on her heels with her blacking brush in her hand and laughed without seeming the least out of temper. "Aye, I know that," she said. "If there was a grand missus at Misselthwaite, I should never have been even one of the under housemaids. I might have been let to be scullery maid," which is in the kitchen, "but I'd never been let upstairs. I'm too common, and talk too much Yorkshire. But this is a funny house for all it's so grand. Seems like there's neither master nor mistress, except Mr. Pitcher and Miss Medlock. Mr. Craven, he won't be troubled about anything when he's here, and he's nearly always away. Mrs. Medlock gave me the place out of kindness. She told me she could never have done it if Misselthwaite had been like other big houses." "Are you going to be my servant?" Mary asked, still in her imperious little Indian way. Martha began to rub her grate again. "I'm Mrs. Medlock's servant," she said stoutly, "and she's Mr. Craven's. But I'm to do the housemaid's work up here and wait on you a bit. But if you won't need much waiting on—" "Who is going to dress me?" demanded Mary. Martha sat up on her heels again and stared. She spoke in broad Yorkshire in her amazement. "Cannot thou dress thyself?" "Thysen, not thyself, thysen," she said. "What do you mean? I don't understand your language," said Mary. I forgot," Martha said. "Mrs. Medlock told me I have to be careful or you wouldn't know what I was saying. I mean, can't you put on your own clothes?" "No," answered Mary quite indignantly. "I never did in my life. Ayah dressed me, of course." "Well," said Martha, evidently not in the least aware that she was impudent, "it's time thou should learn. Thou cannot begin younger. It'll do thee good to wait on thysen, I guess. Thysen, thysen a bit. My mother always said she couldn't see why grandpeople's children didn't turn out fair fools, what with nurses, and being washed and dressed and took out to walk as if they were puppies. It's different in India," said Mistress Mary disdainfully. She could scarcely stand this. But Martha was not at all crushed. I can see it's different," she answered almost sympathetically. "I dare say it's because there's such a lot of blacks there instead of respectable white people." Sorry about that, was the times. "And when I heard you was coming from India, I thought you was a black too." And I guess she's talking about the Indian people. Mary sat up in bed furious. "What?" she said. "What? You thought I was a native?" "Yeah, an Indian from India." You daughter of a pig." Remember, that's the worst insult that you could give somebody in India. "Who are you calling names?" she said. "You needn't be so vexed. That's not the way for a young lady to talk. I've nothing against the blacks," and she's talking about the Indians. "When you read about 'em in tracts, they're always very religious. You always read as a black's a man and a brother. I've never seen a black, and I was fair pleased to think I was going to see one close. When I came in to light your fire this morning, I crept up to your bed and pulled the cover back careful to look at you. And there you was, disappointedly, no more black than me, for all you're so yeller." And that's, I guess, the cholera. Mary did not, and which I guess she doesn't have, but I don't know why she says that. Mary did not even try to control her rage and humiliation. "You thought I was a native? You dared? You don't know anything about natives. They're not people. They're servants who must salam to you." Salam. It's S-A-L-A-A-M, I guess. Salam or salam to you. "You know nothing about India. You know nothing about anything." She was in such a rage and felt so helpless before the girl's simple stare, and somehow she suddenly felt so horribly lonely and far away from everything she understood, and which understood her, that she threw herself face downward on the pillows and burst into passionate sobbing. She sobbed so unrestrainedly that good-natured Yorkshire Martha was a little frightened and quite sorry for her. She went to the bed and bent over her. "Ah, you mustn't cry like that there," she begged. "You mustn't for sure. I didn't know you'd be vexed. I don't know anything about anything, just like you said. I beg your pardon, miss. Do stop crying." There was something comforting and really friendly in her queer Yorkshire speech and sturdy way, which had a good effect on Mary. She gradually ceased crying and became quiet. Mary looked relieved. "It's time for thee to get up now," she said. "Mrs. Medlock said I was to carry thy breakfast and tea and dinner into the room next to this. It's been made into a nursery for thee. I'll help thee on with thy clothes, if that'll get you out of bed. If the buttons are in the back, thou cannot button them up thyself." When Mary at last decided to get up, the clothes Martha took from the wardrobe were not the ones she had worn when she arrived before Mrs. Medlock. "Those aren't mine," she said. "Mine are black." She looked the thick white wool coat and dress over and added with cool approval, "Those are nicer than mine." "These are the nice ones I must put on," Martha answered. Mr. Craven ordered Mrs. Medlock to get 'em in London. He said, "I won't have a child dressed in black wandering about like a lost soul," he said. "It'll make the place sadder than it is. Put color on her." "Mother," she said she knew what he meant. Mother always knows what a body means. She doesn't hold with black herself. "I hate black things," said Mary. The dressing process was one which taught them both something. Martha had buttoned up little sisters and brothers, but she'd never seen a child who stood still and waited for another person to do things for her as if she had neither hands nor feet of her own. "Why doesn't thou put on thy own shoes?" she said when Mary quietly held out her foot. "My ayah did it," answered Mary, staring. "It was the custom." She said that very often. It was the custom. The native servants were always saying it. If one told them to do a thing their ancestors had not done for 1,000 years, they gazed at one mildly and said, "It is not the custom," and one knew that was the end of the matter. It had not been the custom that Mistress Mary should do anything but stand and allow herself to be dressed like a doll. But before she was ready for breakfast, she began to suspect that her life at Misselthwaite Manor would end by teaching her a number of things quite new to her. Things such as putting on her own shoes and stockings, and picking up things she let fall. If Martha had been a well-trained fine young lady's maid, she would have been more subservient and respectful, and would have known that it was her business to brush hair and button boots and pick things up and lay them away. She was, however, only an untrained Yorkshire rustic who had been brought up in a moorland cottage with a swarm of little brothers and sisters who had never dreamed of doing anything but waiting on themselves and on the younger ones, who were either babies in arms or just learning to totter about and tumble over things. If Mary Lennox had been a child who was ready to be amused, she would perhaps have laughed at Martha's readiness to talk, but Mary only listened to her oddly and wondered at her freedom of manner. At first she was not at all interested, but gradually, as the girl rattled on in her good-tempered, homely way, Mary began to notice what she was saying. "Ah, you should see 'em all," she said. "There's 12 of us, and my father only gets 16 shilling a week. I can tell you my mother's put to it to get porridge for 'em all. They tremble about on the moor and play there all day, and Mother says the air of the moor fattens them. She says she believes they eat the grass same as the wild ponies do. Our Dickon, he's 12 years old, and he's got a young pony he calls his own." And Dickon here is the little boy that we'll meet. It's spelled Dickon. "When did he get it?" asked Mary. "He found it on the moor with his mother when it was a little one, and he began to make friends with it and give it bits of bread and pluck young grass for it." Oh, Dickon. Yeah, he's the other fella. "And it got to like him so. It follows him and it lets him get on its back. Dickon's a kind lad and animals likes him." Mary had never possessed an animal pet of her own, and she always thought she should like one. So she began to feel a slight interest in Dickon, and as she had never been interested in anyone but herself, it was the dawning of a healthy sentiment. When she went to bed into the room which had been made into a nursery for her, she found that it was rather like the one she had slept in. It was not a child's room, but a grown-up person's room, with gloomy old pictures on the walls and heavy old oak chairs. A table in the center was set with a good substantial breakfast, but she had always had a very small appetite, and she looked with something more than indifference at the first plate Martha set before her. "I don't want it," she said. "Thou doesn't want thy porridge?" Martha exclaimed incredulously. "No, thou doesn't know how good it is. Put a bit of treacle on it, or a bit of sugar." And I've heard of treacle before, but I'm not sure what that is. Treacle. "Aye," said Martha, "I can't abide to see good victuals go to waste." And that's a word Mom used to use too. Victuals and victuals, food. "If our children was at this table, they'd clean it bare in 5 minutes. "Why?" said Mary coldly. "Why?" echoed Martha. "Because they scarce ever had their stomachs full in their lives. They're as hungry as young hawks and foxes. I don't know what it is to be hungry, said Mary with the indifference of ignorance. Martha looked indignant. Well, it would do thee good to try it. I can see that plain enough, she said outspokenly. I've no patience with folk as sits and just stares at good bread and meat. My word, don't I wish Dickon and Phil and Jane and the rest of 'em had what's here under their pinafores. Why don't you take it to them, suggested Mary. It's not mine, answered Martha stoutly. And this isn't my day out. I get my day out once a month, the same as the rest. Then I go home and clean up for Mother and give her a day's rest. Mary drank some tea and ate a little toast and some marmalade. Marmalade. You wrap up warm and run out and play, you, said Martha. It'll do you good and give you some stomach for your meat. Mary went to the window. There were gardens and paths and big trees, but everything looked dull and wintry. Out? Why should I go out on a day like this? Well, if I doesn't go out, I'll have to stay in, and what has that got to do? Mary glanced about her. There was nothing to do. When Mrs. Medlock had prepared the nursery, she had not thought of amusements. Perhaps it would be better to go and see what the gardens were like. Who will go with me? She inquired. Martha stared. You'll go by yourself, she answered. You'll have to learn to play like other children does when they haven't got sisters and brothers and plays for hours. That's how he made friends with the pony. That's how he made friends. Oh, I just said that. He's got sheep on the moor that knows him, and birds as come and eats out of his hand. However little there is to eat, he always saves a bit of his bread to coax his pets. It was really this mention of Dickon which made Mary decide to go out, though she was not aware of it. There would be birds outside, though there would not be ponies or sheep. They would be different from the birds in India, and it might amuse her to look at them. Martha found her coat and hat and pair of stout little boots, and she showed her her way downstairs. If they goes round that way, they'll come to the garden, she said, pointing to a gate in a wall of shrubbery. There's lots of flowers in summertime, but there's not nothing blooming now. She seemed to hesitate a second before she added, one of the gardens is locked up. No one has been in there for 5 years. Why? Asked Martha in spite of herself. Here was another locked door added to the 100 in the strange house. Mr. Craven had it shut when his wife died so sudden he won't let no one go inside. It was her garden. He locked the door and dug a hole and buried the key. There's Mrs. Medlock's bell ringing. I must run. After she was gone, Mary turned down the walk which led to the door in the shrubbery. She could not help thinking about the garden, which no one had been into for 10 years. She wondered what it would look like and whether there were any flowers still alive in it. When she passed through the shrubbery gate, she found herself in great gardens with wide lawns and winding walks with clipped borders. There were no trees and flower beds and evergreens. There were trees. There were trees and flower beds and evergreens clipped into strange shapes. So, topiaries, I guess. And a large pool with an old gray fountain in its midst. But the flower beds were bare and wintry, and the fountain was not playing. This was not the garden, which was shut up. How could a garden be shut up? You could always walk into a garden. She was just thinking this when she saw that at the end of the path she was following, There seemed to be a long wall with ivy growing over it. She was not familiar enough with England to know that she was coming upon the kitchen gardens, where the vegetables and fruit were growing. She went toward the wall and found that there was a green door in the ivy, and that it stood open. This was not the closed garden, evidently, and she could go into it. She went through the door and found that it was a garden with walls all around it, and that it was only one of several walled gardens which seemed to open into one another. She saw another green door, revealing bushes and pathways between beds containing winter vegetables. Fruit trees were trained flat against the wall, and some of the beds, and over some of the beds there were glass frames. The place was bare and ugly enough, Mary thought. As she stood and stared about her, it might be nicer in summer when things were green, but there was nothing pretty about it now. Presently, an old man with a spade over his shoulder walked through the door leading from the second garden. He looked startled when he saw Mary and then touched his cap. He had a surly old face and did not seem at all pleased to see her. But then she was displeased with his garden and wore her quite contrary expression, and certainly did not seem at all pleased to see him. Goodness, this is going on and on and on. I'm going to stop her right there. Certainly did not seem at all pleased to see him. Okay? And we will be in whatever chapter this is, 4. Come on, bookmark. There we go. Okay. First line is going to be, what is this place? I've got the bookmark right there. But maybe I'll go up here and highlight. This is cool. I really need to spend more time looking at all the features of the Kindle. Anywho, that scare you. 37 minutes, almost 38 minutes. Woo-hoo! Be sweet. Don't be ugly. Love y'all.